My world that I want to have a little pride in. My world, and it's not a place I have to hide in. Life's not worth a damn till you can say I am what I am.
Good afternoon and welcome to LGBT Life and welcome to Dublin City-fm. I'm your host Mick FitzGerald. Well, the major change in the environment, apart from the miserable weather since we were here last week, there's an election being called, and while all the others are focusing on the lower house here at LGBT Life, we're talking about the upper house today, namely on Seanad, and that's why we're delighted to have as our guest in the studio a candidate for the NUI panel, Ross GoldenBannon. So, Ross, welcome to LGBT Life.
Thank you very much indeed. It's delighted to be here, in out of the rain and the cold.
I was about to say, Ross, I must be delighted you decided to go for the Seanad rather than the Dáil in a miserable weather like this.
Well, I certainly did my fair share of knocking on doors in the wind and rain in the referendum last year, so it's a welcome break, I suppose.
Can I ask you, because the posters, I have never seen such a blitz of posters now, and I thought to myself, I'd hate to see myself 100 times just on the way into town. I mean, how would you feel about that yourself?
You have to have a pretty thick skin, don't you? But I don't think that's not something that really happens with the Seanad elections anyway. Yeah. I do think they're a little bit of a necessary evil, though. I mean, when you chat to your friends about, and you ask them about what constituency they're in and who their TDs are, people often struggle and really in the end vote for a party. Colours almost. Yeah. So I think they're a necessary evil to remind people who's actually in their constituency. Even myself, it's a welcome reminder to me that people up on the posters are in my constituency.
Yeah. Well, I did cause convulsions with a 1:30 bus driver on the way down as we were stopped on the North Strand near yourself. I said to him, "What do you say about Jay Leno? Politics is showbiz for ugly people." And he's I think he agreed. But Ross, coming back to yourself, to me you're a familiar figure because I've met you I've seen you around at particularly the LGBT events without ever having the delight of speaking to yourself. So tell us just a little bit about Ross Bannon. Who is Ross Bannon and where do you come from, and what's your role in life these days?
Well, I suppose I grew up in Sutton in Dublin, but then I also lived for many years in London. I lived for 15 years in London. I worked in the House of Commons there, actually. Yeah. So I did a lot of work there around, obviously for my Member of Parliament, but also did a lot of voluntary work around LGBT issues as well, around the age of consent, and worked voluntarily with Stonewall, etc. So I've always had an interest in politics in some way or form. And then I'm, as you know, I've been involved in on the board of marriage equality for some 10 years or so now. So when I came back from the UK, I kind of couldn't resist getting involved in something. So I suppose that's part of my upbringing, and to be fair to our Catholic upbringing here, I think that there is an element of reaching out and trying to engage with the civic community that I think comes from our Catholic upbringing, actually, not that I'm a Catholic anymore. So when I came back, I ended up doing a lot of work, volunteer work with the Dublin Rape Crisis Centre. Then I was on the board of Cherish, and then I ended up on the board of marriage equality. So I suppose it's only natural that now that marriage equality is defunct, our mission statement was to put ourselves out of business, and we have. So the board will wind down in the next month or so, and for me it seems a natural progression then to stand for the Seanad. I have another world that maybe people maybe do or don't know about, which is the food world.
Yes.
For many years I've written about food as restaurant critic in the Sunday Business Post, and as editor of Food and Wine magazine, and I'm contributor to Irish Country magazine, which is the publication of the Farmers Journal, and I'm a member of the Irish Food Writers Guild. So as a member member of the Guild, sometime last year we created a document called The Health of the Nation, covering a number of areas to do with food, from labelling to food education, and a number of other areas that we feel really strongly and concerned are not part of the national debate. So it's kind of a combination of those areas. I suppose that could be distilled into sustainability and equality.
The question immediately comes to mind is, how does somebody who is so closely associated with food and being a food critic, how do you stay so slim, Ross?
Luckily, this is radio and nobody can see my muffin belly hanging out over my waistline.
No, you're still you're probably not snake hips, but you're still a slim hip groover. Can I ask you, just stepping back, I was in London pretty much through most of the 70s when it really wasn't a great time to be Irish in London. Did you ever feel any of that animosity, or had that whole political, shall we say, animus dissipated by the time you had gone there?
That was quite interesting, actually, because I started working in the House of Commons just after the Labour victory in '97. So it was almost the reverse. Okay. If you were Irish, it was fashionable to be Irish and connected with the new government. So actually it was a really positive thing. I'm not sure if it was exactly the same experience for me, say 5-8 years earlier, but certainly during the early Labour years it was a very positive thing. And I think that's still the case in London now. I think things are very, very different. The Irish contribution to British society is greatly lauded over there.
Yes,
and,
yeah. How by the time you came back here, I presume then that, if you like, the LGBT entertainment and social scene had evolved dramatically, because I came back here in whatever it was, 94, 95, and I had come back from Sydney, which is one of, which is really one of the global LGBT hotspots. And I'll be honest, I found it quite tame by the time I came back here. But fortunately, I met people like Panty, and we had the gag ball and all of that, and the whole scene evolved, particularly through the alternative Miss Ireland. What was your experience? Because London has quite a dynamic LGBT scene and quite a diverse one as well.
I found, in some ways, I found it parochial, but then in other ways, I found it far superior to London. Obviously we're all huge fans of Panty, but really when you compare Panty to other stage shows in London and even in New York and further afield, there is a cleverness and a sharpness and a political commentary that goes on with that you just don't find in drag shows in London. So I absolutely loved that. I was blown away by that. So and also that's built over into the annual Pride. No, but also the event that was in March every year that you just mentioned, and it's now gone out of my head. But the Alternative Miss Ireland, Miss Ireland, which is like such an incredibly crazy, unique, mad event. So I did find, on the one hand, that kind of stuff was really, really forward thinking, and also I suppose an expression of who we are as Irish people, as talkers, as engagers. I did find the scene a little stifling. I found the scene very small. I found that in many ways LGBT Irish people are the exact same as the rest of the population, in that we can be very inward looking and don't look beyond Ireland, and that can be quite stifling if you've lived abroad for a long time. However, I made great friends and had loads of fun in some of the other areas, like out and about hikers. I haven't been hiking for a while, guys, sorry, but spent many happy years hiking with them. And then there was the Front Runners in the Phoenix Park, which Mark Rooney founded with just 5 people, and now has easily 70 or more members, So suddenly to discover all these extra things that were going on. And I think also because as you get a little bit older, you're maybe less interested in going to clubs and pubs, and so you kind of enjoy other things as well.
Yeah, I'll come back to that point, because I found it quite interesting in the sense that when I came back here, when you look at it, it was much more villagey, and I liked that in the sense that when the Sydney I had left was putting up signs saying women aren't welcome, and then you go to the lesbian bars and there's no men's toilets, stuff like that. It was starting to become quite segregated in that sense, whereas you come here and the men talk to the women, and it was because it was so small, I think we all realised that we better get on.
Yeah, well, I suppose, do you know what, to be fair, that wasn't always the case in Ireland,
I
you know?
suspect not, yes.
And in fact, I noticed that when I came back as well, and I was just so delighted with that there was the lesbian community and gay community, like gay men hung out together in the same space. And it just seemed so much more progressive. So, you know, in some ways we were very progressive, in other ways we weren't. But I felt that was just really exciting. And when friends of mine came over from London to visit me, they kind of couldn't believe it, because like gay men hanging out in London, they don't see lesbians at all.
Certainly don't, do they? Yeah. On that basis, then, let's talk to the highlight of 2015, the 22nd or the 23rd of May, really, when self-expression came to the fore. You must have felt this is the vindication that we have all essentially lived our entire lives for.
Yeah. I mean, I couldn't begin to explain the feelings. It was just extraordinary. It went on for quite a long time afterwards. I got up on the Sunday, which was the 24th of May, rather late after the partying on the Saturday night, and I started to listen to songs I hadn't listened to in a long time, like Labby Sifri, The Higher You Build Our Walls, Nina Simone, I Wish I Knew How It Was to Be Free, and suddenly those songs I had listened to for years and years and years had an entirely different meaning. And I didn't know, and none of us really knew, that a piece of legislation, a piece of change like that would actually have an emotional impact on our lives, on our actual lives. And that is what happened to me on the Sunday. I wandered around Dublin, soaking up the atmosphere and actually feeling what it was to be free. It was a real feeling. It wasn't just something on a piece of paper.
Were you as blown away as I was, that particularly in areas like you would know and that I would know, like Ballymun and Donamead and all those areas, they were overwhelming in favour of yes. And I think it certainly surprised me that such views would get acceptance in those areas. How did you feel about that?
That was a very curious experience, because I canvassed out in Sutton, Howth and Baldoyle, and so that's where I grew up. And you would expect a certain amount. Of,
shall we say, familiarity.
Yeah. Now, do you know what? We got late 60s and some early 70% yeses, and certainly in my road in Glencarrig, it was a very, very high turnout and a very high yes. But there was a significantly high number of vociferous no's. In
places like Raheny, I had heard that
in Sutton and Howth, and in very, very smart. It seems to me that the bigger the car, the less they wanted to share the Constitution with you.
Was that male?
And so that was mostly male. And what was interesting about that was that shook, I suppose, our kind of bourgeois take on, certainly on urban areas of the country, that people thought, you know, Irish Times reading, bourgeois kind of people, they'll all be yes, and they weren't. So it was a real shock to discover that places where I'd grown up and there was so much negativity. And I think perhaps made me redefine what desirable neighbourhood to live in meant.
Indeed. Well, as I say, you're now in the north.
And I'm in North Strand.
So my understanding is that the North Strand and Dublin Central were pretty supportive.
Oh yes,
so that's that's the hood I grew up in, so I'm quite happy to do with that. Ross, let's move on to the Seanad then. I mean, I'm going to start at the very back of your one, where you put the Seanad. Well, in fact, I'll start off with the NUI one, because something I noticed is that with the NUI panel, I think there's about 6 or 7 people running in it, is there? Every one of them is declaring themselves as an independent. Now, I know at least 2 on that panel that are party members. Can I ask you then the obvious question? Do you have any affiliation with a party, or have you had any affiliation with a party? Just so we'll get that one out of the way.
No, I mean, not particularly. I did, of course, work for the Labour Party in the UK. That was the party that I worked for in the UK. I'm not a member of any political party here now, and in fact, I have canvassed with lots of different parties here. I felt I needed to return the favour to several public representatives who were knocking on doors with me during the referendum campaign, and I've helped out several public representatives from Avril Power to Eoin O'Riordan and Catherine Zappone, you know, and you know, I do feel there's a cross-party belief through a number of those public representatives that I feel needs to be supported. So I was happy to knock on doors for them.
Yes, well, that's the attitude we've taken with LGBTlife, is that people who have been supportive of the LGBT cause, and it doesn't matter what party they are, I'm very happy to endorse their as we say, their contribution. But if I move on then, Ross, if I have a look at the back, and you're saying it's almost the last point you make, but it's the first one that came to my mind, and that was equality and change. Yes, the Senate itself is probably one of the most equal institutions in the sense of the word. And what I mean by that is that quite a few people don't get to vote in it. How do you feel about that? Would you like to see that constituency for the Senate change so that it became a universal franchise?
We absolutely need Senate reform. I absolutely accept that. And in fact, I could if I did get elected, I could end up voting against myself. But I do think that we need an upper chamber that does not mirror the lower chamber. I think there needs to be a small section of it that reflects the present system, but a reformed version of the present system that will in some way reflect different interests in society, all the way across from the arts through to industry, and that in some way will mean that we don't end up with a complete mirror of the lower house, because then I just think then it's kind of pointless then. Yeah. We do need an upper chamber because we need greater scrutiny of legislation, not less. We have a very weak committee system, unlike the UK. They have an absolutely Rolls Royce committee system there, which means they can often end up with really superb legislation. We don't have that kind of committee system, which means that we need the upper chamber even more. It's interesting you say that there's people who are standing as independents who are party members, but in fact, strictly speaking, it isn't supposed to be a party stand. If you look at the ballot papers that come out, they never say what party they're connected to, even if they are officially connected to a party. So that was the original principle of it, and you were supposed to be representing areas of expertise within the upper house. So in principle, it was a good idea. And I was in the UK, and they were forming the House of Lords, and the Irish system was looked at quite seriously because of the way it drew expertise from different sectors of society, which meant that they could properly scrutinise legislation that came through in their area of expertise. In the end, they went for a different system. But essentially, I do feel we need radical reform of the Senate, but it can't be a mirror of the lower house.
On that basis then, and I suppose the universal franchise is the one that gets me. If we're going to have a radical reform, surely everybody should have a say in it.
Yes.
What I've suggested over the years, something that I saw when I was in New Zealand, if you were a Maori person, you could either vote in your geographical constituency or you could vote in a Maori constituency. This was for the lower house, so it ensured that there was at least some degree of Maori representation. I've proposed that perhaps one of the ways we reform the Senate is that you end up with something like you declare yourself for a constituency, and for instance, if there was an LGBT constituency, I'd be happy to say, yep, that's my constituency, and I will only vote for LGBT people, and if they wanted a religious one, good luck to them, and they could all do it. How do you feel about reforming it along certain interest lines? That was the original intention.
Yeah, that was the intention.
To ensure representation.
I think that's they are the kinds of ideas that I think could really, really work. And there's no reason why we can't have conceptual constituencies.
Sure.
And it's just an expansion of the original concept. So, absolutely, I think that makes a huge amount of sense.
Yeah. Can I ask you then, I was talking to somebody who's in TCD, and I've been making jokes about, can I run for TCD? No, I can't, because I went to UCD, and that's...
Oh, no, that's not true.
Is it not?
You don't even have to be a graduate to stand for the Senate.
Do you not?
Now, I can't even vote for myself. I'm not a graduate of an Irish university.
Oh, okay. I thought it was that hard and fast.
No. You don't have to be a graduate of an Irish university to stand, but you do have to be a graduate to vote.
Yeah.
So I'm that strange person who is who's both helped and.
So you'd be a bit. How would I say, bi-electoral?
Bi-electoral, exactly. Yeah. But but just to say, universal suffrage. I absolutely support, but we don't have universal suffrage in Ireland. We don't have, not enough young people are registered to vote. Lots of people who are on lower incomes tend not to vote. And what does that do to our policies? It skews policies, because politicians can't help themselves. They look at the policy and they go, do you know what, there are no votes in that. So they ignore it. So that's why government was caught on the hop in May, because they're not connected to a younger population. They're not connected to people who believe in change. So they were reflecting an older point of view of life in Ireland, and they were caught on the hop, and they were really surprised at the result. So I would quite like to see compulsory voting, to be honest.
Okay. That's another interesting one we could come back on, Ross. How do you then feel about it? I mean, it's called a panel rather than a constituency per se. Do you interpret it that your role then is to represent the people that might be eligible to vote for that panel, or do you see it as that, well, there's an element of that, but also you're there as, I feel like, as a voice of expertise, a voice of conscience, or that includes all those disenfranchised people as well?
Yeah, I think it's a broader remit than just representing the National Universities of Ireland. When you think about it, that covers everybody from Maynooth to UCD to UCC and a number of other smaller institutions who have expertise in many different areas. So look at the schools in all of those universities cover many different subject areas. So I think at the very least you're absolutely representing education, but you're also representing the wider views that might come out of the different schools of those universities.
You've mentioned that you're involved in, for want of a better cliche, a foodie. So tell us, how do you then see, what would you define as the important issues that particularly relate to that area, particularly with health, nutrition, a whole range of subjects there, Ross?
This is absolutely fascinating area. There's a very basic fact at the moment that just seems to be ignored by government around food policy and around health policy, and it is this: for the first time in human history, we are no longer dying of pathogens. The biggest killer is now diet. That's the biggest killer.
That's interesting, yes.
So, but our policies aren't really reflecting this. Like, put it this way, it costs obesity and food ill health is costing us 1.13 billion per year. So what's happening is we are trapped in an economic worldview that means that we just keep trying to lift people out of the river instead of looking upstream and seeing why they're falling in the first place. We need to radically change how we look at the economy. And there is, unfortunately, a dogmatic economic consensus across almost all parties, bar some on the very edge, who are then used as an example. If you try and critique the present economic climate or present economic dogma, fringe parties are brought up to speak against it and then just kind of ridiculed. Now, outside of Ireland, that is not the case. There's some very serious people who are critiquing the present economic model. I think that absolutely has to change. What's really interesting is, if you look at what Leo Varadkar did, say, in the last 12 months, there's two very interesting things that he did. And, I like him in many ways, but he did two things in the last 12 months. One of them represents that kind of neoliberal view of the world, and the other one represents an old world view of the state intervening. The first was, he had this brilliant idea that at the very least for the civil service, he would introduce legislation about being healthy in the workplace. Brilliant. I'd like to see that for the whole state. So it would be great to roll that across the whole state. That's real old world, post-war state intervention in the health of the nation. However, and then this really, then we come to hospital food, okay? And sugary food and nutritionally shallow food being sold in hospitals, okay? Leo Varadkar's response to that is that we will put a bigger tax on sugar, being sugary food sold in hospitals. It's a solution, but it's a solution that comes from a neoliberal approach to the marketplace. Clearly, what has to happen is the state needs to intervene and stop the sale of these foods. Because in the present situation, The only people who profit are some tax income for the state, not very much, profits for the people who are selling the food, and the loser is actually the citizen who's eating poor food.
Yeah, it's very interesting you should say that, Ross, because I took somebody to task over this last Saturday when Dublin City Council were privatising to a certain degree the Red Stables. One of the assurances we were given as residents that there would be no overspill into the park. I was down there last week. There's stalls there now. I mean, how did we live without dumplings, or how did we live without kebabs and chips? And they're at eye level. It's all these fizzy drinks. And I thought, Dublin City Council, you should be ashamed of yourself. The little you bring in and the harm you cause. We don't need those things. And it's very interesting that you would probably endorse something.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And we sadly have a very poor record in this area, whereas if we look at countries like Spain, who have an incredibly successful tourist sector, they have a thing called paradors. Paradors are state-owned ancient monuments and buildings that are turned into hotels with restaurants, and yet they're state-owned. And if you've got a bit of money, that's absolutely where you go and visit when you're in Spain, because they're always at the absolute highest standard. I think there are maybe 2 restaurants in government ownership in Ireland still today. But imagine if we did that in Ireland, with great monuments that they were owned by the state. They were a profit centre for local communities, and the food was bought from local farmers and local contractors. It's a model for a more successful and diverse business sector, instead of the system where we have now, which is mass contracts that cover the whole nation that don't include local suppliers.
Ross, unfortunately, we're going to run out of time. I'd love to talk to you about shelter. I'd love to talk to you about your clearly sophisticated view of markets and the way they do and don't work. When is the Senate date? Have they announced it yet?
So so they just announced it last night, actually. So the electoral ballot is on the 21st of the ballot papers were sent out the 21st of March, and then the poll closes on the 26th of April. So you've a little bit of time to get your poll back.
So, well, look, we might even get you back between now and then, and we can continue on this. But in the meantime, Ross GoldenBannon, our candidate out there in NUI, we wish you all the very best.
Thanks very much indeed for having me
today.
That I want to have a little pride in my world, and it's not a place I have to hide in. Life's not worth a damn till you can say